Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State. Welcome to our last class period. This is our final review, and it's class period number 34. And I'm glad that you have been with us throughout this semester as we've worked through our class on ethics and values. I hope that you found the issues interesting and challenging, and that they've been areas where you could visit with your family, your friends, and others, and talk about how these issues relate to your everyday life, how they've affected the past, how they affect the present, and how they can also affect the future. So thank you for being part of this class, and I'd like to thank the students who are here with me today as well for being part of this class. And over here I've got John and Rhonda, and over here I've got Kisper and Aaron. It's been such a pleasure to have you students helping me with these discussions, and also helping the students understand better the concepts that are in these articles. And I deeply appreciate your help on this. Well, let's go ahead and get started on our final review. We've got a lot to get through, and the first one is helping us move from business ethics into our transition on environmental ethics. Hebert, and the topic: Human Vocations, Origins and Transformations in Christian Traditions. And John, would you read the first graphic for us, please?
Yes. Development was to have created well-being and affluence for all in the third world. For some regions and some people, it has delivered that promise, but for most regions and people, it has instead brought environmental degradation and poverty. Okay, so Hebert then is saying that there are some who have been privileged by development, but others who have faced much deeper poverty. Let's read the next two graphics, and Rhonda, would you read these, please?
Where did the development paradigm go wrong? One, it focused exclusively on a model of progress derived from Western industrialized economics, and on the assumption that Western-style progress was possible for all. Development, as the improved well-being of all, was thus equated with the westernization of economic categories. Development thus became a continuation of the colonization process. It became an extension of the project of wealth creation in modern Western patriarchy economic vision.
Okay, and so on this one, Aaron, he's saying that the development paradigm showed that we were very much privileging a system of economics. Any comments on this?
Well, I think what he's beginning to get into is this idea that that while westernization and this concept of industrialized progress only works in certain areas and for certain people, and as he puts it in that end quote, I think is great, is the modern Western patriarchy's economic vision. So it's a one-sided view.
Okay, thank you. And would you read our next graphic for us, please?
Sure. Development focused exclusively on such financial indicators as GNP or GDP. Good. What these indicators could not demonstrate was the environmental destruction and the creation of poverty associated with the development process.
Okay, thank you. John, did you have your hand up on this?
No.
Okay. Any comments?
Just basically that when you're talking about pure numbers, when you're just talking about financial gain, then the environment is kind of left out of the question. Okay, thank you. And also we have our author Shiva, who says pretty much the same thing. And let's move on to 769, where she's talking about the impoverishment of the environment. And she's going to say women and children are last when it comes to the impoverishment of the environment. And Kisper, could I get you to read this for us on UN Decade for Women?
The almost uniform conclusion of the decade's research is that, with a few exceptions, women's relative access to economic resources, incomes, and employment has worsened. Their burden of work has increased, and their relative and even absolute health, nutritional, and educational status has declined.
Okay, and so moving on from the article by Hebert, we can see where she is telling us that women and children even have a worse outcome when it comes to economics and the environment. Any thoughts or comments on this, Kisper?
I don't.
Okay, thank you. She tells that pretty strongly, just that way. And let's read the next one, 770, GMP's exclusion of women and children. And Rhonda, would you read that?
The exclusive focus on incomes and cash flows as measured in the GNP has meant that the web of life all around women, children, and the environment is excluded from central concern. The status of women and children and the state of the environment have never functioned as indicators of developments.
Okay, thank you. And so, John, what's the problem with having these not part of an indicator of development, the status of children and women?
Well, just that they will suffer. The women and children will suffer as a result of them not being considered.
Okay, thank you. And it moves them into a poverty trap, as we see in 773 and 774. And I'll have you read those for us on poverty trap and where they move into this vicious cycle.
Okay. The poverty trap created through the vicious cycle of development, debt, environmental destruction, and structural adjustment is most significantly experienced by women and children. In 1988, 500,000 children died as a direct result of debt-related adjustment policies that sustain the North's economic growth.
Okay, thank you. And so in these two articles then, we can see that there are often economic indicators that we don't want to look at, that the economic system is not working in these countries. It's not working for the women and children, and we see poverty rather than seeing progression. Anything that any of you would like to add? Aaron.
I like the way that we segue from the Heber into the Shiva, and so that they both make that point about the gross national product or the gross domestic product, that by looking at those numbers, not only does the environment suffer, but people suffer as well. And I think that's a good thing to take from both of those.
I think so too, yes. And did you have your hand up, Rhonda?
I was just thinking, here in 1988, this is quite some time ago, almost 20 years ago. And, as we talk about third world countries today, that number has deepened dramatically.
And so it's continuing in the downward spiral.
Yeah.
Thank you for that observation. Well, we'll move on to our next article, 775, by Hawken, A Declaration of Sustainability. And now we're moving in a more straightforward line, talking about environmental ethics. And Hawken saying, is there a way that we can develop better global sustainability? And John, would you read this next one for us? Socially responsible companies.
There is a growing vanguard of companies attempting to redefine their social and ethical responsibilities. These companies no longer accept the maxim that the business of business is business.
And continue on, please.
Their premise is simple. Corporations, because they are the dominant institution on the planet, must squarely face the social and environmental problems that afflict humankind.
Okay, so he's going to take this a step further from just the notion of having that businesses have a social responsibility, and he's going to say we must move away from the notion that making money is the only thing that a corporation does, and he's going to say sustaining our human life is going to be more important. Anything that you'd like to add to these that you just read then, John?
That's pretty good. I think he makes a really good, strong point when he says that corporations, because they are the dominant institution on the planet, do have a responsibility.
Okay.
That's a good point.
And that we're not doing enough. And in 779, he asks us what is needed. And would you read this for us, Aaron?
What is needed is a conscious plan to create a sustainable future, including a set of design strategies for people to follow.
And so he's going to start on this by saying, let's take back the charter. And could you continue reading that one for us as well, Aaron?
Corporations are chartered by and exist at the behest of citizens. Incorporation is not a right, but a privilege granted by the state that includes certain considerations, such as limited liability. Corporations are supposed to be under our ultimate authority, not the other way around. The charter of a corporation is a revocable dispensation that was supposed to ensure accountability of the corporation to society as a whole.
Okay, and I think that some of us, when we were visiting about this, said, we didn't realize that. We didn't know that we could revoke a corporation's charter. It has seemed like that they're all powerful. They can do whatever they'd like. Kisper.
And not only that we could, but that it's the citizens' responsibility in a way to make sure these companies are doing what they should be to benefit society and the environment.
Okay, very good.
Particularly because corporations are entities. They're not persons. Entities can't be sued or made responsible.
So he's
persons.
saying, yes, and so he's saying one way you can do this is revoke this charter. And he continues on, and would you read this for us, Rhonda?
When any corporation abuses or violates the public trust, citizens should have the right to revoke its charter, causing the company to disband, sell off its enterprises to other companies, and effectively go out of business.
Okay, thank you. So just finishing his point there, saying if a corporation isn't willing to look at sustainable policies, then we need to be able to ask that corporation to go out of business and allow those who will let us have a global sustentation through business stay some. And let's go ahead and look at utilities, 783 and 784, where it's going to tell us, it's going to conclude for us that companies should exist as utilities. And could you read this for us, Rhonda?
Negawatts are the opposite of energy. They represent the collaborative ability of a utility to harness efficiency instead of hydrocarbons. This conservation-based alternative saves ratepayers, shareholders, and the economy money, savings that are passed along to everyone.
And the next?
All resource systems, including oil, gas, forests, and water, should be run by some form of utility. There should be markets in nega-barrels, nega-trees, and nega-coal.
Thank you, Rhonda. Well, Kisper, as we look at this article, then we can see that he's telling us that we don't pay for the things that we consume. We're really not paying the full costs of using coal and oil and other things. What else did you find compelling in this article?
Well, he's saying that we're not paying the costs of these things. We're paying for the costs of production possibly and the costs to the company, but we're not paying the costs of the effects it's having on the environment, the effects that it's having on people's lungs, and just all those outside things. We're not paying those costs, we're just paying the costs of production.
Outstanding, very good. Well, let's move on then to our next article. The next article is by Peter Singer, and he's asking us, are all animals equal? And in this article then, his answer basically is yes, and he's going to say that we really shouldn't be discriminating against animals and making them suffer as we do. And so he's going to start this out by asking about suffering. And John, could you start by reading the first two graphics on can they suffer?
Yes. The question is not, can they reason? No, can they talk? But can they suffer? The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interests in any meaningful way. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted with the like suffering of any other being. If a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account.
Okay, so he's going to establish this notion of suffering. Why is it important then that he start by establishing this notion of suffering? Anyone want to comment on that? John?
Yeah, I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but just that, I mean, if animals are suffering because of how we treat them, then we must take that into account.
Okay, and he's going to go on and talk about animals as food and ways that we make animals suffer when we consume them as food. Rhonda, did you have a comment?
Well, I was just thinking too that the human being is referred to as one who can reason, you know, and that sets them apart from all other living beings. Therefore, if they're set apart, can they feel happiness, joy, pain, whatever else that's included in that? And yes, they do.
Okay. And let's go ahead and pull up the next couple of graphics. And Rhonda, would you read them for us?
Animals as food. In order to have meat on the table at a price that people can afford, our society tolerates methods of meat production that confine sentient animals in cramped, unsuitable conditions for the entire duration of their lives. Animals are treated like machines that convert fodder into flesh. Our practice of rearing and killing other animals in order to eat them is a clear instance of the sacrifice of the most important interests of other beings in order to satisfy trivial interests of our own. The decision to cease giving it that support may be difficult, But it is no more difficult than it would have been for a white Southerner to go against the traditions of his society and free his slaves. If we do not change our dietary habits, how can we censure those slaveholders who would not change their own way of living?
Okay, thank you. What do you think about this point then that he's making between us using animals as a means to an end and also the comparison to slaves?
Well, I think he goes a little far in comparing it to slaves personally. I think that we probably all don't think about the animals that are confined so that they might provide food for us. Perhaps if we thought about that a little bit better, there might be, some other regulations that are a little bit better towards them. Personally, I like meat.
Yeah. And Kisper, we can see a connection between this and our last article, can't we? We can see that there are costs associated with the production of animals that maybe are hidden costs, and that we're asking for low costs but not really considering all the suffering. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Right, and in a way it's almost saying that if we, combining the two articles, if we want to make improvements as far as the suffering of these animals, then we need to be a little more willing to pay a higher price for the meat of better conditions for those animals.
Okay, thank you. And Erin?
I think it's interesting that Singer brings up the point of the comparison between slavery and the way that animal production goes on, particularly in our own country, because when it comes to his writings regarding other human beings, he's very radical in his sense of our responsibility to those human beings. So I don't really expect any less of him to expect us to be responsible for animals as well.
I think it holds very true to Singer's philosophy, and a very strong utilitarian as well. Well, let's continue on to our next article, which is by David Keller and entitled Gleaning Lessons from Deep Ecology. And in this article then we're going to be looking at, do we have human-centered point of view when dealing with the environment, when living our lives, or are we understanding a land ethic? And let's first look at slide 801, which tells us what is deep ecology. In fact, there are 3 slides that give us some information on that. And Kisper, could you read those for us?
Yes. What is deep ecology? There are 2 interrelated underpinnings of deep ecology's non-anthropocentrism. The first is the principle that all biota have equal intrinsic value. The phrase biocentric equality expresses this principle. The second principle is that the biosphere does not consist of metaphysically discrete individuals, but ontologically interconnected individuals comprising one unbroken whole. This is a principle of metaphysical holism and is known through the process of self-realization. Therefore, we can characterize deep ecology as an egalitarian and holistic theory.
Okay, very good. So when he's talking about non-anthropocentrism, then he's saying we're moving away from having a focus on ourselves to having a focus on animals, plants, and even dirt, the earth itself that sustains us. And so he's going to say this is a holistic theory. This is a theory that's going to be egalitarian, keeping all of us more on an equal plane. Any questions with this concept then? And he's going to say that sometimes we move on into, we can move into extinction if we're not more careful with this. And in slides 806 and 807, he tells us about extinction and these dangers. And John, could you read 806 and 807, please?
Yes. In both Galapagos and Hawaii, feral goats and pigs must be killed in order to ward off the extinction of other species which are necessary for the overall integrity and stability of those delicate tropical island ecosystems. In an ecosystem, the flourishing of some species is incompatible with the flourishing of other species, and the flourishing of all species is also incompatible with the health of the entire ecosystem.
Okay, so you can see that it makes a lot of sense here that when we bring in a species that should not be on a particular piece of land and they thrive, that we have done damage to that ecosystem, to that ecology, or that we can remove plants, that we can remove other rocks or things that make it sustainable for this species, and once again cause an extinction there. So we need to be very careful to make sure that whatever we do does not upset the balance. Any thoughts or questions on this? Okay, thank you. We also had a wonderful piece from Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, and I don't have any slides on this, but just want to make sure that you understand some of the concepts that he is also talking about in the land ethic. And when he talks about the land ethic, you'll see some of the very same language that we see in the David Keller article, where he's saying we need to care a lot more about the land. And writing this piece in the 1930s, we can see that he's truly a pioneer, where he's saying we give so much privilege to human beings and to animals, but we don't think about the land and how precious it is to us. Anyone want to make any points on Aldo Leopold and the land ethic? Rhonda.
I see the three things that are listed here in his three ideas, the land energy circuit. Is that
Go
okay?
ahead and say them.
Land is not merely soil. Native plants and animals kept the energy circuit open. Others may or may not. That man-made changes are of a different order than evolutionary changes and may have effects more comprehensive than is intended or foreseen. And I find that, you know, in the 30s that he wrote basically this, he indeed was a pioneer. Nobody was thinking in terms of those things then.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Well, let's move to our next area. And now that we're no longer in environmental ethics, we've moved on into two class periods in existentialism. And when we start looking at existentialism, we use the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. And in this, we start with the notion of deontology, but we're moving to act deontology rather than rule deontology. And in this, we say that every choice that we make is vital in defining who we are. And so our choices, every choice that we make, must be made with earnestness, with pathos, and with a true understanding that this defines us as a person. In this article, he talks about radical subjectivity. Radical subjectivity is basically the process I just described, that you really understand that you are building a subject, you are building you in these choices that you make. And Erin, could you read for us the first two graphics on that?
Of course. All essential knowledge relates to existence, or only such knowledge as has an essential relationship to existence is essential knowledge. It means that knowledge has a relationship to the knower, who is essentially an existing individual, and for this reason, all essential knowledge is essentially related to existence. Only ethical and ethico-religious knowledge has an essential relationship to the existence of the knower.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin. Do you want to tell me a little bit about what that means?
Well, it's a lot to unpack, but nonetheless, I think what we're trying to describe here is the idea that that what we know is entirely related to our own perspective, and as the knower, the subject, hence all knowledge is subjective, and therefore it builds upon that idea in talking about what the essential or required knowledge that we have is. He says ethical and ethico-religious, those things that involve our own subjective relationship with the world.
Very good. And as we look at Kierkegaard, then we see there are three areas where he is going to help us in understanding the decisions that we make. And he's going to say the first area is what's going to be aesthetic. And he's going to say these are choices that maybe you allow someone else to make it for you. I say, gee, what do you think I ought to do in this circumstance? Or I don't make a decision at all. I'm supposed to return a phone call to someone and tell them something. I make the decision actually not to call back and not to participate or whatever it is. And so I'm making a decision not to decide. And he's going to say these are going to be our lowest of areas of making choices, of understanding subjectivity and the ethics of subjectivity. Then we move on into the ethical, and this is where we do ponder our choices, where we do make those decisions that determine who we are, and that there is a time and a course and a time when we need to make sure that we have studied for a test, so to speak, and that we can take that test and do well on it, that we don't wait until after the test has been taken to study for it. And so he's going to say, you know, these choices are very important, and there is timing to these choices. His last choice, the leap of faith. And this is where he talks a lot about religion in numerous books that he's written. And he's going to say, this is an absurd notion because I can't explain my faith to you. And I can't produce God, say, here is God, and let God tell you that this is the case. That instead, I take my leap of faith because I do it alone and because I believe and because this defines who I am. And so he's going to say this is the highest level of subjectivity. Anyone want to comment on that at all? Okay. John, no, you're fine with that?
Yeah,
okay.
that's great.
Well, we'll have you read the next graphic on that then.
Ethics concerned with individuals.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Ethics closes immediately about the individual and demands that he exist ethically. It does not make a parade of millions or of generations of men. It does not take humanity in the lump any more than the police arrest humanity at large. The ethical is concerned with particular human beings and with each and every one of them by himself. If God knows how many hairs there are on a man's head, the ethical knows how many human beings there are.
Okay, thank you very much. And so he's going to say what you must know is that ethics is internal, and that you must always know what your choices are, what your options are, and make those choices with a true earnestness and pathos. Then we move on into a non-religious existentialist, and this is Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche then is going to tell us that our choices are very important, and that too often we have cultural and historical choices that have already been made for us, and we don't even question them, and that they can put us into an area of slave morality rather than an area of being able to control our own lives. And Kisper, would you read the first graphic for us?
Pleasure-pain philosophies incorrect. Whether it be hedonism, pessimism, utilitarianism, or eudaimonism, all those methods of thinking which measure the worth of things according to pleasure and pain, that is, according to accompanying circumstances and secondary considerations, are plausible modes of thought and naiveties, which everyone conscious of creative powers and an artist's conscience will look down upon with scorn, though not without sympathy.
Okay, do you want to tell me a little bit about that, John? Why does he not like our pleasure and pain philosophies, our utilitarianism?
In a very basic way, Nietzsche believes that pain is necessary. It's a necessary component to life, and we need to experience it in order to live a fulfilling life.
Okay,
So,
nothing wrong with some suffering, and
No.
certainly we know he had suffering in his own life.
Yes.
Another area, Aaron, where he's moving on this is he's also saying, you don't have to believe all the philosophers. In fact, you don't have to believe any of them if you don't want. They privilege their own position, and why should you let them be making choices and decisions for you? Any thoughts about that?
Well, Nietzsche's going to place a lot of value in the creative process. When he talks about creative powers and an artist's conscience, what he's not talking about is necessarily someone who paints,
Yeah.
but someone who does take part in a creative process of creating their own value system, of creating their own person, of creating the opportunities that they have within their own life to overcome suffering. So I think that's where he wants us to turn.
Okay, thank you. And then we have his his moral philosophies. We have two types. That we have the master morality and the slave morality. And John, what's the master morality?
Master morality is the morality that defines things in terms of good and bad, and it's a very self-affirming morality where I identify my life as good, and everything that's opposite from me or opposed to me is bad. And it's just, that's just the value judgment. It's a very self-affirming value judgment.
Okay, and if we're going to contrast this with slave morality, what would that be, Aaron?
Slave morality would actually flip that around a little bit. That's our transvaluation. And so you're going to see things defined as good and evil versus good and bad. And I'm going to define the evil first. I'm going to say those things that are despicable out there are evil, and then I am good, what I associate with myself in relation to that. This is where Nietzsche points out specifically the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that
it enslaves.
Yeah.
Enslaves one. Mm-hmm.
And so that's the anything that would help slaves being humble, being meek, these kinds of ideas.
Sure, doing good to others. And instead he's going to say, you need to have a will to power, and a will to overpower, and something that really helps you stand out in life. And let's pull up this next graphic on it, and it tells us just a little bit more about it. Rhonda, could you read that for us?
The moral philosophies, two types, the master morality and the slave morality. And the master morality is the noble and despicable equate good and evil. The noble man is exalted and proud. The noble man is aristocratic, believes the common people to be untruthful, not the modern morality.
Okay, thank you. And the next graphic on that as well?
The noble type of man regards himself as a determiner of values. He does not require to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. He knows that it is he himself only who confers honor on things. He is a creator of values. He honors whatever he recognizes in himself. Such morality is self-glorification.
And the continuation of this?
The noble man also helps the unfortunate, but not or scarcely out of pity, but rather from an impulse generated by the superabundance of power.
Okay, thank you. So for Nietzsche...
He bestows it.
Yes, he bestows it. And for Nietzsche, it would be important then to have this superabundance of power. You would want to be the one who is able to bestow this on whom you would like and where you would like.
Exactly. There are no leaps of faith here.
No, there aren't. And any thoughts or questions?
Not yet.
Okay, well then, do you want to read slave morality for us, John?
Yeah. Slave morality. The slave fears the powerful. Skepticism and distrust of happiness. The morality of modern ideas. Essentially the morality of utility. Within this morality lies the origin of the antithesis good and evil.
And continue.
It is here that sympathy, the kind, helping hand, the warm heart, patience, diligence, humility, and friendliness attain to honor. For here, these are the most useful qualities and almost the only means of supporting the burden of existence.
Okay, and the last one.
Okay. A last and fundamental difference, the desire for freedom. The instinct for happiness and the refinements of the feeling of liberty belong as necessarily to slave morals and morality, as artifice and enthusiasm and reverence and devotion are the regular symptoms of an aristocratic mode of thinking and estimating.
John, any comment on that?
Yeah, just to elaborate on a point that Erin made earlier when she was talking about the transvaluation of morals, slave morality is going to end up viewing everything that master morality views as good as evil, and everything that master morality views as bad as good. So it's a complete reversal of those, of the morality.
Okay, thank you. And Erin, one last point on this.
I think it's important to remember that the will to power is something we can't escape. We have it no matter what. It's that Nietzsche says that master morality is more honest in its expression of that will to power, whereas slave morality is dishonest in its inward expression, and he just wants us to move beyond that dishonesty.
Thank you. And other continental philosophers, as well as existentialists, then pull up on that very notion. Maybe Jacques Derrida and also Foucault, Michel Foucault. All right, now we move on into two very important issues that affect us in many ways, affect us in ways of life and death. And the first one we're going to be looking at is war and nuclear war. And we looked at Carl Sagan's classic piece, The Nuclear Winter. And in looking at the nuclear winter, we had a couple of guests joining us, Omar Cater as well as Wayne Hanowitz, and had some good discussions on this. So let's pull up the first graphic where Sagan's going to tell us that we should never use nuclear weapons again. And would you read this for us, Kisper, please?
Except for fools and madmen, everyone knows that nuclear war would be unprecedented human catastrophe. A more or less typical strategic warhead has a yield of 2 megatons, the explosive equivalent of 2 million tons of TNT. In a 2 megaton explosion over a fairly large city, buildings would be vaporized, people reduced to atoms and shadows, outlying structures blown down like matchsticks, and raging fires ignited.
Okay, thank you. And so in this article, he's telling us that we have a dangerous tendency to underestimate the effects then of nuclear weapons and what it would be like if they were used. And talks about that one of the worst things that would happen is that the dust and other debris caused by the nuclear explosion would filter the sunlight and cause it so that we would turn into a state of nuclear winter. And let's look at graphic number 826, which tells us that not only would we have persistent darkness for weeks, but we'd also have temperatures below freezing for months, thus deeply affecting our food supply. And Erin, would you read this for us, please?
Of course. Even more unexpected were the temperatures calculated. In the baseline case, land temperatures, except for narrow strips of coastline, dropped to -25 Celsius, -13 Fahrenheit, and stayed below freezing for months, even for a summer war.
Okay, thank you. And he's going to say basically, if we start using nuclear weapons, we will all be annihilated, and has been very concerned about this. In our last graphic, he's going to say we really should always assume the worst about nuclear weapons rather than the best. And Rhonda, could you read this last one for us?
Sure. Nuclear war is a problem that can be treated only theoretically. It is not amenable to experimentation. It is possible that there are further adverse effects that no one has yet been wise enough to recognize. With billions of lives at stake, where does conservatism lie in assuming that the results will be better than we calculate, or worse?
Thank you. You know, it's so important for us to never underestimate the costs of using nuclear warheads. And this is a very classic article in reminding us of that. Now we move on into the historical portion of the War and Nuclear War section. And this is by Bertram Lesser, and he's talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and he's also talking about the just war concept. And he's going to say in this that we've always had the ability, kings, sovereigns, and others, to make up laws and rules for their own lands and what they would like to have upheld. And what did you think was a major part of this article, Kisper?
A major point he hit on was the just war concept, and that there are requirements for a just war.
Okay, and let's go ahead and pull those up, 832 and 833, that we had a just war criterion, and that we also have moral criterion for conducting war. And Erin, would you read these first 7 criterion for us?
There are elaborate accounts that have been developed over the years that give criterion for a just war. These criterions are from Michael Mitch's article, When Soldiers Aren't Heroes. 1. Have a just cause. 2. Be waged by a legitimate authority. 3. Be formally declared. 4. Be fought with a peaceful intention. Peace must be its goal. 5. Be a last resort. 6. Have a reasonable probability of success. 7. Use means proportionate to the ends sought.
And continue, please.
Moral criteria for conducting war. 1. Non-combatants must be given immunity. 2. Prisoners must be treated humanely. 3. International treaties and conventions must be honored.
Okay, thank you. And so in here then he's saying before you go into war, you must have very just conditions. Once you're in war, then you must be very careful that you do not injure the innocents, the non-combatants, that prisoners are treated humanely, and that we observe all international regulations and rules that have been established, and that sometimes that can be a very difficult thing. Now from here we move on into what the Catholic bishops have to say about war and nuclear war, and basically they're against nuclear war. They almost in here come out and say that nuclear weapons are immoral in and of themselves, not just the use of them. And they really believe that perhaps the money used for nuclear weapons should be used in helping the poor, in helping developed countries that need development, in assisting in other areas that Christianity would find helpful in their doctrine. And let's go ahead and look at the very first 2 graphics that they have, and would you read these for us, Rhonda?
The use of nuclear weapons. It is clear that those in the Church who interpret the gospel teachings as forbidding of all use of violence would oppose any use of nuclear weapons under any conditions. In a sense, the existence of these weapons simply confirms and reinforces one of the initial insights of the nonviolent position, namely that Christians should not use lethal force, since the hope of using it selectively and restrictively is so often an illusion. Nuclear weapons seem to prove this point in a way heretofore unknown.
Okay, thank you very much. And so as we move from the bishop's position, which is a very strong pacifist position, we find then another position by Victor Danner. And in this position, then he's going to tell us an Islamic view on war. Also in your book is a Jewish position on war that basically says that the Lord has created the earth, that because of the flood, he promised that the earth would never be destroyed again, and that the belief is that the Lord will not allow the use of these weapons so that the earth is destroyed again, that there has already been a promise. And so for the Jewish faith, it is important that the weapons not be used, but also they believe that the Lord won't allow it. Let's look then at what Danner has to say about war. And sometimes they're going to say in the Islamic faith that we have a greater jihad and a lesser jihad, with the greater jihad being a spiritual war inside us and a lesser jihad being when we feel we need to go out and fight. And Danner does tell us that the Islamic tradition has always been one of violence, and that conversion has been that way as well. And let's see what he has to say on slides 846 and 847 about the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. And actually, I think I'm supposed to say jihad, so let me say the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. And could you read these for us then, Erin?
We should also recall here the distinction made by the Prophet between the lesser jihad, or military warfare, and the greater jihad, or spiritual warfare. The latter pits the virtues in man's soul against the vices and passions with a view to the ultimate triumph of the spirit within man over its interior enemies. The peace of soul that follows the round of spiritual battles in the greater jihad is the contemplative prototype of the peace that should follow the military warfare of the lesser jihad.
Okay, thank you very much. Outstanding article, and then we move into two other historical pieces. The first one by Arado Sada, and in this he talks about experiences that children had when they saw the bombing of Hiroshima, how their families were destroyed, how they saw many, many burn victims, how they saw many people who had died and whose bodies were in the waterways, and it was difficult to even get fresh water. And so these stories then were very powerful for us. And from there we move on into an article by Marion Yass, which is the decision to bomb Japan, from the book Hiroshima. And in here it starts out with having President Roosevelt in office and dying, and then President Truman needing to work with Secretary of War Henry Stimson to decide, should we go to war or not? And Stimson on slide 852 tells Truman, why don't we set up a committee to think about this? And so let's go ahead and read what is said about this interim committee. And Rhonda, could you read this?
To recommend action that may turn the course of civilization. In our hands we expect soon to have a weapon of wholly unprecedented destructive power. Our great task is to bring this war to a prompt and successful conclusion. We may assume that our new weapon puts in our hands overwhelming power. It is our obligation to use this power with the best wisdom we can command.
Okay, thank you very much. And so then the interim committee decides that they will not warn Japan. They will say, you can give us a complete surrender, a complete withdrawal, or we're going to use this weapon of mass destruction. They do not get their unconditional surrender, and it is used. So tough point in history, and many people hoping that never again will this be used. From here we have a couple of wonderful literary pieces. One of them is by Richard Lovelace in Lucasta Going to War, where we talk about the important notion of honor in war, and that so often that we honor our families, we honor our country, we honor ourselves by going to war. And in Luigi Pirandello's piece called War, we find a husband and wife who have just sent their only son off to war. And they're visiting with a man who is quite cavalier about the honor of war, and that his son has just died and that there could be no greater honor. But in the end of the story, find him breaking down into tears, and that he's finally mourning and grieving his son's death. And so the real realities of war, that we do experience casualties and terrible traumas. And Mark Twain's war prayer does basically the same thing to us. In the war prayer, then, he tells us that there's another side to a prayer for victory, that there's also a prayer for defeat, and that this defeat is truly not a good Christian prayer. Our final piece was Silly Asses. Anyone here want to tell me about Isaac Asimov's piece, Silly Asses, and what happens? John, you've got a big smile.
Yeah. In Silly Asses, there is an alien being that is kind of the record keeper of the whole universe, of all the planets in the universe, and there is a messenger that comes to him and says, there's another planet that has reached maturity, and the guidelines for maturity is that this planet has reached thermonuclear power. And the record keeper says, well, which is it? And he says, Earth. The messenger says, Earth. And he says, oh, great, well, then I guess Earth is going to be making contact with us soon then. And the messenger says, oh no. He says, well, where are they testing their thermonuclear power? And the messenger says, on their own planet. And the wise alien being says, silly asses. And then as he puts them on the list of planets that have reached maturity, he crosses them off a list of planets that are going to survive, planets that are alive.
Very good. A wonderful piece. We now move into the last area of this class, which is sexuality. We're going to look at the morality of sex, and some of these class periods were explicit, and some of the review for this class period can be explicit. We start out with the very historic court case, Roe versus Wade. And in this court case, we find that women historically had been given unsafe abortions. Therefore, there were laws saying that women could not have abortions because the safety factor was pretty horrible. Well, with Roe versus Wade, Justice Blackham starts out by saying women can now get safe abortions, and they should be entitled to them with a right to privacy. And so by citing Amendments 1, 5, 9, and 14, he says that a woman is entitled to her own reproductive freedom. He gives 3 criterion for the states in determining when a woman can and cannot have an abortion. And let's go ahead and pull up the first graphic, and Kisper, would you read this on the first trimester?
For the stage prior to approximately the end of the first trimester, the abortion decision and its effectuation must be left to the medical judgment of the pregnant woman's attending physician.
Okay, basically that she must have an abortion in a clinic that is licensed to give first-term abortions by a physician who has also practiced in this. And let's pull up the second graphic, and Rhonda, could you read this, please?
For the stage subsequent to approximately the end of the first trimester, the state, in promoting its interest in the health of the mother, may, if it chooses, regulate the abortion procedure in ways that are reasonably related to maternal health.
Okay, and so once again in this he's saying a woman is entitled to a second trimester abortion. In the state of Utah, this is up to 21 weeks in a clinic that is safe, that is authorized to give second trimester abortions by a physician who is also licensed to do the same, as these are tougher abortions, and then moves into the notion of viability. And John, would you read this last graphic?
Yes. For the stage subsequent to viability, the state, in promoting its interest in the potentiality of human life, may, if it chooses, regulate and even prescribe abortion except where it is necessary, in appropriate medical judgment for the preservation of the life or health of the mother.
Okay, thank you. So basically, that a third trimester abortion is not acceptable unless it is to save the life of the mother. Now we move into a historical piece by Linda Gordon, and she talks about the prohibition on birth control and also the criminals, the women who did use birth control. And her very first statement on this, Erin, would you read this?
Birth control has always been socially regulated in some way. This is because birth control has consequences for 2 social issues crucial to overall social development: sexual activity and population size.
Okay, thank you. So she says not only sexual activity and population size, but she's also going to say to control some of the sexual roles that women have. In here she moves in and she talks about Victorian prudery and other areas that cause women to have a very defined sexual role. And she's going to say they don't have much choice then in their sexuality. Then we move on to an important piece by Judith Jarvis Thompson, A Defense of Abortion. And Judith Jarvis Thompson is writing this piece before Roe versus Wade. And she's saying there need to be some reasons why a woman could have an abortion. And the first one dealt with the violinist analogy. Who can tell me a little bit about this? Erin.
I can. Basically, the scenario is that suddenly you wake up one morning and have another human being attached to your kidneys. He happens to be a famous violinist. The Society for Music Lovers, I think is who it is, comes to you and says, well, sorry, we didn't know that that had actually happened, but basically you're going to have to be attached to the guy for 9 months, because if we detach him from your kidneys, then he'll die, and we're really attached to this famous violinist. But it's only 9 months is pretty much where they ended.
And basically, so thank you, Erin, the analogy is that this is the case of rape. And she's going to say, in the cases of rape, in the cases of incest, in the cases of birth control failure, that a woman should not feel guilty about considering or having an abortion. And she kind of equates it with this notion of the Good Samaritan and the minimally decent Samaritan. And she says, you know, maybe a Good Samaritan would go ahead and have the child, but she says a minimally decent Samaritan could go ahead and say, I had done everything possible not to have a child. I still have this unwanted pregnancy, and so does terminate it. Then we move on into Pope Paul in Humanae Vitae, and he is not going to allow for abortions in any case. So whether the mother's health is at stake, or whether there's been rape or incest, a life is not to be taken. So first of all, anything natural that would happen is fine with the Pope. So if there is a miscarriage, that would be fine. But if it comes down to between the life of the mother and the child, there must be strong consideration. Perhaps this woman has already lived 21 years, and so now should we allow the baby a life? The second thing that the Pope really focuses on here is the importance of marriage, the sanctity of chastity, the sanctity of the sacramental covenant that someone makes to their spouse, and that all sex should be for procreation purposes and should be within the bounds of marriage. So the Pope is very strong about this. But in contrast to the Pope's position, we have Daniel McGuire, who is from Marquette, and the title of his piece is A Catholic Theologian at an Abortion Clinic. Who wants to tell me a little bit about McGuire's visit, his 4 visits actually to the clinic? Rhonda, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, he talks about attending a clinic where abortions are done. And first there's the zealous picketers who are demonstrating outside. 95% of them are teenagers who deliver babies. They keep them. The next is a case of abortions which include failed vasectomies and other contraceptive failures, and you know, just those people who have less than or have need of an abortion in those cases. The next case would be a woman who is under psychiatric care for manic depression, and she's receiving large doses of medication which can cause harm to a fetus. The third would, or the fourth rather, would be the meeting of the picketers, where the guard has to take the patients in from their cars because of the inability to go quietly and nicely in something that's a very delicate state anyway.
Yes, and I think that you mentioned that the majority of these picketers then were men,
Yeah.
and then the majority of those people who were needing abortions were young teenagers.
Teens.
Yes. And he also said that he met the embryos, and the embryos, what?
Well, he said that they fit in a cup, it wasn't, it was a mass or a lump of something rather than a fetus or a baby as we would consider an infant to be.
Thank you.
I think his main points after going to this clinic and visiting these things and seeing the picketing going on outside and seeing the women in their situations, and he becomes more sympathetic towards them and says, well, these picketers are giving more importance to the life of the fetus rather than what's going on with the woman. And so he's becoming more sympathetic towards the women through going to this clinic.
Thank you. And you know, as we move on into our Jewish attitude toward abortion, we find that it's a very difficult and complicated article, and that this is one where, first of all, the Jewish faith wants to say, when does life start? And basically they're going to say, most scholars say it will be when the child breathes its first breath. But in the second half of the article, they say, really, there's no need for abortion. Why wouldn't you want to have a large family? Why wouldn't you want to have all this happiness around you? And so they do say we don't have prohibitions on abortion, but then on the other hand, it makes no sense to us. The next area is why Islam permitted contraception, and some of this had to do with the polygamous state that was allowed, that there were numerous wives, concubines, and slaves, and that property was very fundamental in this. And then we moved into a wonderful literature section. We looked at a piece by A.J. Cronin, a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and a wonderful, wonderful short story by Ernest Hemingway, Hills Like White Elephants, and had such a strong discussion on that. I've really enjoyed being in this class with all of you. I hope you've done well in the class, and I hope you do well on the final exam. These are all found in your packet, these notes and the readings, and I hope that you'll get in touch with me or one of my teaching assistants if you have problems in the class. I'd like to thank so many people who have helped with this class: Channing Lowe, Janelle Mitchell, the students who are all here. We've got Rhonda, John, Aaron, and Cassie here with us, but others who helped out were Lloyd and Cassie. Did I say Kisper? I did say Kisper. I said Cassie and meant Kisper. So thank you, and thank you to a wonderful crew. I've got wonderful people who have been operating camera and graphics, and just couldn't have been more kind and professional. Thank you.